Thank you very much. Well, it's a pleasure to be here in a panel with friends, firsthand. And secondly, I would like to thank Raul and Amaya for the enormous effort that you're making and for this wonderful Congress, right? I have changed slightly the content of my presentation as I thought or as I realized that not many people would have read John Carson. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk as well about the use of magical realism in more or better known authors such as Joyce and Yates and so on, right? I will try to be quick as I know that we are running out of time and everybody wants to go for coffee. All right, so why doesn't it work? Yeah, okay. So according to Isabel Allende, magic realism is a literary device or a way of seeing in which there is space for the invisible forces that move the world: dreams, legends, myths, motion, passion, history. All these forces find a place in the absurd, unexplainable aspects of magic realism. It is the capacity to see and to write about all the dimensions of reality. Regarding Irish literature, we can state that that other world is not so clearly separated from this empirical world in the Irish imagination as in other Western European cultures. The Irish seem to have consistently incorporated the fantastic in their literature. Do you know what's happening? Yeah. Presumably because the fantastic has always been felt to be part of the Irish reality. As Mary in Stuart Parker's Northern Star remarks, and I quote, "We are all well used to the walking dead. We have more spooks than living bodies round these parts." Indeed, the absolute dominance of reason and rational thinking emphasized by 18th century Enlightenment did not have the same influence in Irish thinking as in other Western European cultures. In that century, Ireland was to see Berkeley's subjectivist immaterialist philosophy, Swift's Gulliver's Travels, and Sterne's Tristram Shandy, often considered to be the first postmodern novel. In fact, the giants, descendants of gods and goddesses, or ghosts, who are both impossible to the modern consciousness and possible since familiar from tales and storytelling, seem to find their way naturally into Irish contemporary literature, even though perhaps altered or naturalized. In truth, all these elements span reality only if we limit reality to the visible world. But if we agree that reality comprises dreams and memories, as well as phenomena we cannot explain, then they bring to the surface layers of reality otherwise concealed. According to Landau, and I quote, "Fantasy and our conception of what is fantastic depend upon our view of reality. What we find improbable and unexpected follows from what we find probable and likely and the age." Following this definition, the Irish fantastic, with a few exceptions, would not fall into the category of the fantastic, but rather into a mode of intense realism, which includes what in other cultures would belong to the realms of the impossible. Indeed, the Irish fantastic remains closer to the ancient mythic view than modern fantasy if understood as the creation of the individual mind, as myths themselves are not fantastic since they symbolically portray reality. Thus, the all-inclusive mythic view holds the four-dimensional universe, the transcendental and the empirical worlds together in a unity, in a natural interrelation with each other. As late as the beginning of the 20th century, Irish writers such as Yates, A.E., Lady Gregory, or O'Casey were well aware of the Cartesian split between matter and spirit, but they were not as affected by it as modern writers because of the pressure in the milieu of pre-scientific or archaic attitudes. However, mythical realism was already present in many texts of the Irish revival, especially in the early plays of the Abbey Theatre, whose writers can be said to have been among the first to grasp that fantasy. In fact, Yates, perhaps more than any of his contemporaries, came to acknowledge the role of the fantastic in the Easter Uprising and to understand the way the fantastic intersected with desire, violence, and the supernatural. Kathleen Lee Houlihan written for the most part by Lady Gregory and revised shortly before the uprising, was first staged in 1902. The play, filled with symbolism, focuses on men sacrificing their lives for Irish independence. In spite of the fact that Yeats claimed that the play influenced some to participate in the rising cannot be conclusively substantiated, the play was seminal in the literary history of the uprising in that it was remarkably prescient. In the play, Kathleen Ni Houlihan, who represents Ireland, goes to a home where there is about to be a marriage and convinces the future groom, Michael, to give up the wedding to fight. While trying to convince Michael to choose his country over his bride, Kathleen Ni Houlihan admits that there will be many deaths by stating that, and I quote, "They that have red cheeks will have pale cheeks for my sake, and for all of that they will think they are well paid." The closing scene of the play, which juxtaposes several discourses of desire with imminent violence and a supernatural transformation, anchors Kathleen in the fantastic. And I quote, "Peter to Patrick, laying a hand on his arm. Did you see an old woman going down the path? Patrick, I did not, but I saw a young girl, and she had the walk of a queen." On his part, the Irish novelist James Joyce inherited the late 19th century tradition of the naturalistic novel, and the motto at the beginning of the opening of a portrait, "and he turns his mind to the unknown arts," suggests that his flight was to be not only from provincial Ireland to the mainland, and from Roman Catholicism to the great archetypes of myth, but also from the naturalistic novel to the archetypes of mythology. We must bear in mind that for Joyce, modernism did not signify a move from unifocal realism to multifocal hyperreality, but from a realism which never seemed real at all, to a pluralism which tried to give scope to the many voices raised after independence. When Joyce's Stephen Dedalus remarks, "History is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake," he summarizes the dilemma 20th century artists everywhere were confronting. However, if, as Stephen claims, history is a nightmare, should it be depicted as fact or fantasy? Eliot defined Joyce's discovery of the mythical method as a way of controlling, of ordering, of giving a shape and a significance to modern life by manipulating a continuous parallel between contemporaneity and antiquity. Although the mythical method is often understood as an infusion of meaning from the past into the present, Eliot described it as a structure that accommodates countless meanings. The mythical method thus enables the writer to create a symbolic relationship between contemporary life and something else, in fact, anything else. Protestant writer Jan Carson's background is in very politically charged magical realism, which is that of Marquette, Rossi, or Grass, whose political and social analysis is interlaced with the fantastic. In their introduction to magical realism, Lois Parkinson Zamora and Wendy B. Farris summarize the characteristics of magic realism and identify its political value as a means of resisting, and I quote, "monologic political and cultural structures, a feature that has made the mode particularly useful to writers in post-colonial cultures and increasingly to women." The Fire Starters, published in 2019, is set in East Belfast, in a Protestant working class area, in the parade season, when the orange men just parade the city. The point is that the day before this parade, there are bonfires in the city, all right? Those bonfires were supposed to have helped Kimberley find his way through the city and when he was going to fight the battle. The point is that this year, when the Fire Starters is set, what they have done is they have passed a restriction on the height of the bonfires, right? So suddenly there is this person who creates complete havoc in the city. There is complete chaos because this person decides that they are putting limits to their liberties, and he starts just setting fire in the city everywhere. I mean, those bonfires are really high, and they are placed at the beginning in very special places, but after that we find the fires everywhere throughout the city. Right, so The Firestarters is set 16 years after the Good Friday Agreement that ended most of the violence of the Troubles. Carson depicts factions of the post-ceasefire loyalist community as wedded to violence. Indeed, the Northern Irish novelist seems to follow Faris when she claims in her book, Ordinary Enchantments, Magical Realism, and the Remystification of Narrative, that magic realism can even redeem historical violence as it, and I quote, not only reflects history, but may also seek to change it, but addressing historical issues critically, and thereby attempting to heal historical wounds. The Firestarters is mainly a story about parents and the legacy of violence, with two main male characters in their children. Sammy, who is an ex-paramilitary who removes from them when he becomes a father. And I quote, "Your mother doesn't understand that this was never about the politics, the flags and freedom, God and country, of it all. They were only words I stood behind. I did it again and again with fists and guns, and sometimes bombs, for the pure blood rush of being alive. You were the end to this." The point is that Sammy finds out that his son is responsible for the tall fires that threaten to put an end to the frail peace obtained after so many years of violence. People were hopeful about the future and moving towards peace, slowly, but making progress. Now the city is like a raw wound gaping. The old trouble could kick up its heels and go in for another round. The other protagonist of the novel, Jonathan, is a doctor seduced by a siren who comes out of the lagoon. And the point is that this is a siren, okay? She is not the Little Mermaid. She is mainly Homer's siren. She creates shipwrecks, she causes shipwrecks and carnage and so on, all right? And the point is that throughout the whole novel, we have this siren who is the protagonist at some point, and we can hear the sirens relating throughout the city because we have the firefighters, and the police moving around the city at all times. So we have the siren as a warning of the danger which is coming, and then the siren as a mythological creature. Right, so Jonathan has been seduced by this siren, and they have had a child. The siren abandons him, but leaves the child behind. The point is that Jonathan doesn't know whether the child is human or if it is a siren, right? So he's all the time terrified at the idea of his daughters learning to speak because of the possible havoc that her voice may cause. In fact, such is his fear that he even considers cutting the baby's tongue out. Sophie must not speak, for there is no way of being sure what she will say. Jonathan is thinking about cutting her tongue out, and actually he even tries to do it. In the novel, Carson skews masculine righteousness, even though she makes the fathers deal with the threat of violence, as both mothers seem to be absent or incapable of dealing with it. This is not surprising, as we must bear in mind that during conflict, women's claim is to be protected and revered as mothers. In fact, the IRA ideal was close to that of an armed priesthood. Like priests, the men who bore arms were special and should not encumber their idealism with home lives. Thus, the myth of brotherhood, understood as a myth of male independence from women, is a myth of human society with no women and no children, a myth of human life where death is always a chosen act of self-sacrifice for the common good. Historically, radical nationalist rhetoric has defined women's primary role as the reproduction and support of national culture and male nationalist activists, especially as mothers. Images of violent men and victimized women pervade representation of armed conflicts, where women appear as victims of a meaningless violence over which they have little or no control. The victimization of women is a feature of popular fiction, where women are often represented as trapped victims. In Mothers, Whores, and Villains, Bill Roston argues that most Travels fiction has represented women as either passive, pure, and caring mothers, or as whore mothers, a term taken from Sean Heron's The Whore Mother, to illustrate the, and I quote, the metaphor of Ireland as a murderous seductress who incites men to violence and rebellion. Hence, male Travels writing has often portrayed women as either heroic, suffering mothers along the lines of O'Case's Juno, or seductress women along the lines of Yeats and Gregory's Kathleen. In Carson's The Fire Starters, we find a siren who won't put out the fires in spite of water being her element, and who seduces the main protagonist. Dr. Murray, not good enough, no first name, no information. I could be dying here and you'd never know. Jonathan, I say, yes, Jonathan. Jonathan, she repeats. I'm going to call you Johnny. I wish you hadn't called me Johnny. The sound of it is tremendous on her tongue. She has caught at the very thinnest part of me, and I don't know how to say stop. Yet, the siren is not the only magical element in the novel, which is inhabited by mutant children, who are the result of this violence and the legacy of the violence. Yes, like, for example, we have Luis, the daytime vampire, the boy with wheels for feet, or the girl who could only fall in spite of having wings. And then we have Sophie, who is described by her father as a junior Jacob, oscillating between the human and the divine. What's more, Jonathan describes his child as faulty and does not know what to do with her. In his desperation, he recourse to watching the X-Files. He has to realize that neither Mulder nor Scully show any empathy towards the other. I watched the X-Files for inspiration and affinity. Aside from their aliens, Mulder and Scully have little compassion for anything beyond the basic human. The other is always the enemy. In The Firestarters, Carson reminds us that in political conflict, the intense negative categorization of the other often means the adversarial group is denied their humanity, essentially seen as evil and inhuman. Indeed, behind the sectarianism which enveloped Northern Irish society was the construction of the dangerous other, which in many cases was used to justify the killing and mayhem that took place. In short, The Firestarters is a book about Northern Ireland, but not necessarily about the Troubles, in which we can clearly appreciate the reality of the so long-for post-conflict era from which Carson states anger can't be exorcised, and which has affected the lives of the future generations. All right, so these are the references I have employed, and thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.